The day of my father's funeral smelled like overwatered lilies and damp, expensive wool. The sky was an arrogant blue, uninterrupted, cloudless, uncaring. I stood in the back of St. Augustine's chapel, the family pew conspicuously full without me, and watched my half-brother Victor deliver a eulogy like a snake wearing my father's cufflinks. His voice was syrupy, slow, perfectly rehearsed. Each word meant to draw tears from people who had no idea what he'd done, what we'd all let him do. Before I proceed, if you're drawn to cold revenge served through silence and strategy, subscribe now. These stories don't scream, they whisper before they strike. Let's continue. The bastard wore our father's signet ring, heavy, gold, engraved with the family crest, like it had belonged to him since birth. I saw the moment he turned his palm to the crowd, letting the light catch it, as if reminding everyone who the crown now belonged to. It was a performance, and I was the only one who saw through it. Victor had reappeared a year ago, dragging his mother's last name behind him like a rusted chain. He'd sent an email, not even a phone call. "I've been thinking about reconciling," he wrote. "Let's talk about Dad. I should have burned it. I should have warned my father." But by the time I stepped in, Victor was already settled in the guest house and calling the home office ours. He never called our father Dad. He used his name, like they were equals. "Lawrence doesn't need those meds. Lawrence's memory is slipping. Lawrence wants me to handle things now." And like water dripping on stone, he wore our father down with gentle persistence, quiet sabotage, and a smile that mimicked sincerity. At the funeral, people kept telling me how much Victor had stepped up, how he'd handled everything when I was too busy with work. One of the neighbors even said, "He's really the son your father needed at the end." I nodded. I didn't explain. Let them believe that. Let them believe he was devoted. Let them think I had abandoned my father when the truth was that I had been exiled, banished by paperwork, locked out of medical records, told I was agitating him by asking questions. Victor made it look like love, but it was theft, quiet and legal. When they lowered the casket, Victor smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't grotesque. It was subtle, a flicker of satisfaction at the edge of his mouth. A predator closing his jaw after the kill. And in that smile, I knew the will was changed. The trust was drained. The house would never be mine. My name would be dust. After the service, I didn't linger. I didn't visit the grave. I didn't shake hands. I went home and poured a bourbon I couldn't taste and stared at the fireplace like it might speak. My father's portrait hung above it, painted the year he opened his firm. He looked younger, proud, full of ambition. He was the kind of man who believed in legacy, who told me I'd carry his name, his work, his estate. Until Victor convinced him I wasn't loyal. Until he made our father rewrite everything under the fog of fading health. I didn't cry. I researched. The next morning, the probate lawyer, once a trusted family friend, released the will. My name was barely mentioned. Victor was named executor, sole beneficiary of the estate, the house, the accounts. There was no mention of the secondary trust. No detail about the power of attorney. It was all gone. But I remembered the safe. My father kept a ledger. Not digital. Handwritten. He'd shown it to me once in the library, hidden beneath a false drawer in the oak desk. It contained every trust allocation, every document trail, every amendment. Victor didn't know it existed. That's when the plan began. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I would let him enjoy his illusion. Let him gloat. And then, page by page, clause by clause, I would dismantle his kingdom. In silence, I returned to the house 3 days after the funeral. The air had changed. Grief had evaporated into procedural silence. Phone calls, documents, account closures. Victor was managing everything now, which meant he had sequestered himself in the library with my father's files, flanked by lawyers who smiled too easily and spoke in passive legalese. I waited until the staff had gone home. I had called ahead, told Iris, the housekeeper, that I needed to gather a few sentimental things. She didn't press. She'd been here before Victor. She knew me. More importantly, she knew my father. She remembered the way he lit up when I brought home academic awards, the way he beamed at my graduation. She also remembered the tension that crept in when Victor came back, a tension that didn't belong to love, but to obligation. The library door creaked as I opened it, the kind of old wood groan that made me pause instinctively. The room smelled like dust and leather polish. Shelves lined the walls, books left slightly askew as if someone had been pretending to read them. The desk sat under the north-facing window, its green glass banker's lamp still stained with fingerprint oil. Victor had been in here, but not deeply. The oak desk looked untouched. My father had been a creature of habit. He kept no digital files unless he had to. He believed in handwriting, in records you could feel. He'd once told me, hard drives can be erased, but ink remembers. Beneath the middle drawer was a hidden notch I discovered when I was 13 and curious. A simple press-and slide, barely visible unless you knew to look. I reached beneath it and felt the familiar resistance, then the soft click as the false bottom released. The ledger was still there. Thick, bound in cracked brown leather, its pages worn at the corners from decades of updates. I opened it slowly, like cracking the spine of a memory. Each entry was in my father's meticulous handwriting: dates, trust allocations, amendments to the estate, annotations about beneficiaries. It was all here. More importantly, it wasn't what the new will claimed. Page after page, I found names of beneficiaries who had since disappeared from the final version. Charities, longtime employees. Even me, once listed as the sole executor of the living trust. Then, about 6 months before his death, the handwriting changed. Less steady. More notes in the margins, more crossed-out revisions. And then this: Victor recommends liquidation of long-term securities. Says it's urgent. Need to review. That note had a black underline. My father never underlined anything. A few pages later, confused by language in the amended will. Doesn't sound like me. Victor says lawyer insisted. Then, 2 weeks before he died, need to speak to E. About the will. Something is off. My throat dried as I stared at that entry. He had known. Somewhere, beneath the fog of illness, beneath Victor's soft-spoken manipulation, my father had sensed the betrayal. He had tried to reach out, but he never got the chance. I photographed every page. Slowly. Carefully. Then I put the ledger back exactly where I found it. Victor had grown too confident. He thought erasing me from the paperwork meant I no longer existed, that I would go quietly, that he had won. I left the house without a sound. Back in my apartment, I reviewed the photos. By midnight, I had constructed a timeline, a correlation between Victor's arrival, the changes to the will, and the decline in my father's independence. I pulled my father's old medical reports. I found discrepancies. His dosage of cognitive medication had been reduced without clear medical costs. The doctor on record was new, someone Victor had brought in during a crisis. The next morning, I made 3 calls. One to an estate litigator I trusted, one to a forensic handwriting analyst, and one to the private investigator who had once helped my firm expose a corporate embezzlement scheme. Victor thought I was grieving. He didn't know I was documenting his demise. Victor underestimated my silence. That was his first mistake. He believed that because I didn't shout at the funeral, because I didn't contest the reading of the will, because I smiled and stepped back, that I had surrendered. He'd grown accustomed to thinking in straight lines. Aggression equals threat. Silence equals submission. But I'd been raised by the same man he manipulated. Only I paid attention when our father spoke of leverage, of pressure, of precision. The attorney I hired, Diana Mirren, was the type of woman who wore tailored suits like armor and asked questions that left no room for dishonesty. She had handled 3 contested estates in the last year and overturned all of them. When I handed her the digital copies of the ledger, she flipped through them wordlessly, her expression unreadable until she reached the note about the amended will. He knew, she said softly. He knew something wasn't right. You waited until now to bring this to me. I needed to make sure Victor didn't know I had it. She nodded once. Good. Keep it that way. The handwriting analyst confirmed my suspicion within 2 days. The signatures on the new will and the medical directive were inconsistent with the earlier samples in the ledger. Close, but not identical. The pressure was different, the loops tighter, the slant unnaturally forced. Forgery. I stared at the report for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because of what it meant. Victor hadn't just manipulated my father into rewriting his legacy. He had taken his hand, literally or figuratively, and forced the outcome. He had stolen the past, reshaped it, and attempted to erase me with ink. But forgery was hard to prove, and even harder to prosecute when the accused had possession of the originals. That's when I remembered the old man's safe. In the basement, behind a false panel in the wine cellar, was a vault my father had used for insurance. I hadn't checked it yet. I hadn't dared. But if there was one place my father would have stored the uncorrupted version of his estate plan, it would be there. I contacted Iris again. She didn't hesitate. "There's a key in the old Globe bar," she whispered, "behind the bottle of Macallan. I'll make sure Victor isn't home tomorrow morning. You'll have 1 hour." At dawn, I parked a block away from the house and walked through the back entrance, the staff entrance, like I was a stranger in a home I'd once lived in. The walls didn't feel the same. My father's paintings were gone, replaced with minimalist prints. His grand piano sold. Even his old cologne, which used to hang in the hallway like a signature, had been replaced by Victor's sterile, citrusy aftershave. I made my way down to the cellar. It was colder than I remembered. The safe stood tucked behind rows of vintage Bordeaux's my father never drank. The Globe bar was still there. Inside, behind the bottle, I found the antique brass key, etched with our family crest. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. I inserted the key and turned. The safe door creaked open like something out of a film. Inside were several envelopes, each labeled in my father's handwriting. One read simply, "Eleanor and me, 2017 revision." Another, "For the court, if anything changes." My breath caught. That was the one. I opened the envelope. Inside was a complete, notarized will, dated just 1 year before Victor's return. My name was listed as sole executor. A series of educational charities were designated to receive a third of the estate. Longtime employees were named beneficiaries. Victor was granted a modest trust, nothing more. No mention of transferring the house. No medical power of attorney. No liquidation orders. The will was legally sound, and completely different from the one filed with probate. I photographed every page, replaced the original carefully, then closed the safe. As I locked it again, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Calm. Not triumph. Not yet. But the stillness that comes before the strike, the quiet between breath and blade. Victor thought the story was over. He didn't realize the Real will was still buried in this house. And I was about to unearth it, publicly, completely, and with consequences. The day of the hearing felt colder than the weather could explain. Autumn had set in, but the courthouse still clung to its old stone chill, a kind of architectural authority meant to humble those who entered. I wore my father's watch, the one Victor had missed in his sweep, its cracked leather band worn smooth from decades of use. I didn't wear it for sentiment. I wore it because time was finally on my side. Diana sat beside me in a charcoal suit and glasses that caught the morning light like a blade. Across from us, Victor smirked like a man who'd already counted his inheritance 3 times over. His lawyer, a firm handshake and a cheap suit named Marcus Lyle, leaned over to whisper something in his ear. I watched Victor nod. That nod said everything. He still believed this was a formality, that I'd come to make noise and leave empty-handed. The judge was an older man with a reputation for measured ruthlessness. When he entered, the courtroom fell still. He adjusted his robe with slow precision, looked at the docket, then at me. "Mr. Black, you're here to contest the probate of your late father's will." "On what grounds?" Diana stood. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Your Honor, we're prepared to present evidence of forgery, fraud, and undue influence regarding the document currently entered into probate. Furthermore, we have in our possession a prior, legally sound, and notarized will that the deceased created before his cognitive decline and before the respondent, Mr. Victor Hale, entered his care." The word forgery cracked through the courtroom like a pistol shot. Marcus Lyle immediately stood to object, but the judge held up a hand. Evidence? He asked. Diana opened a thick file and began laying it out. The handwriting analysis, the medical records, the sudden changes in medication, the discrepancy between financial records in the ledger and the amended will, and finally, the photographs page by page of the will hidden in the cellar's safe. I watched the judge's expression change not to shock, but to suspicion. The kind of suspicion that says, I've seen this before, and it never ends well for the liar. Victor finally spoke. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising. My father changed his mind. He wanted me to have the estate. He told me himself. No recordings, the judge cut in. No witnesses to that claim. And yet we have notarized documentation stating otherwise. Tell me, Mr. Hale, how do you explain the missing original? Victor flinched. He must have destroyed it. Or changed it later. I didn't know about the safe. The lie came too fast. Too smooth. The judge caught it, as did everyone else. Didn't know about the safe, he repeated. Yet somehow managed to exclude all other beneficiaries and position yourself as sole executor with a power of attorney issued under suspicious medical circumstances? Victor's face turned the color of old bricks. For the first time, the confidence cracked. The judge recessed for 2 hours to review the files in chambers. When we returned, he didn't make eye contact with Victor. He didn't need to. In light of the evidence presented, he said, voice cool and precise, I am issuing an immediate injunction against the execution of the current will in probate. The 2017 document shall be admitted in its place. Mr. Black is restored as executor and primary beneficiary, pending further review. This court also refers the matter of possible fraud to the district attorney's office. Victor didn't look at me when he stood. He stared forward like a man trying not to drown. I met his gaze only once, and it wasn't with anger. It was pity. He had stolen from a dying man. He had tried to erase a legacy built over decades. He had underestimated not just me, but the quiet paper trail our father left behind. And now, all he had was a mountain of legal fees and a future of investigations. I walked out of that courtroom not triumphant, but clean. No heat. No need for raised voices. I hadn't buried him with fists or fire. Just silence. And ink. It took 6 months for everything to settle. Bank accounts reinstated, properties retitled, foundations funded, and the staff paid in full with the bonuses my father had intended. 6 months of signatures, notaries, and slow, methodical reclamation of a life that had nearly been erased. I never expected satisfaction to feel so quiet. There were no victory parades, no dramatic confrontations, just the sound of paper moving through systems and the low hum of a life returning to its rightful hands. Victor had gone silent. After the hearing, his attorneys filed 2 appeals, both dismissed. The district attorney opened a fraud investigation shortly after. I didn't press criminal charges. I didn't need to. I let the DA do their job. Victor sold his apartment to cover legal costs. Rumor had it he fled to a cousin's property upstate, where he lived in a guest house that wasn't his. It was poetic. He had slithered into our father's life like a shadow and left it smaller than when he came. The house, now legally mine, sat quiet under the gray sky of winter. I didn't move in. Not right away. Instead, I walked through it one room at a time, reacquainting myself with ghosts. The scent of mahogany. The dent in the banister where I'd slipped as a boy. My father's office, perfectly preserved by inertia. The globe bar still clicked when it opened, and the wine cellar door still sighed with memory. I didn't touch the safe again. The will had done its work, but I left it as it was undisturbed, like a mausoleum of paper and truth. In the East Wing, I found boxes my father had labeled but never opened. Letters, photographs, journals from his early legal years. I read through them not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. I needed to remember the man as he was before illness, before manipulation. He had been stern, yes, demanding, but he was fair. He had believed in merit, in preparation, in the idea that legacy was earned, not seized. Victor never understood that. He thought inheritance was something you took, something you could forge, rewrite, reframe. But real legacy, my father's real legacy, was in what he preserved: truth, process, documentation. Even in his decline, he left clues. Not for the courts. For me. I chose not to rebuild the estate in his image. I sold the company. I donated the paintings he loved. I kept the library intact. It was the one place he never let Victor touch. And within its walls, I began again. Not as my father's son, but as a man who had seen the depths of betrayal and chosen to rise without becoming what he despised. The headlines eventually faded. Inheritance scandal in prominent family. Forgery allegations rock Hale legacy. Victor's name became synonymous with disgrace, and mine became quiet again, just the way I liked it. I declined interviews. I issued no statements. My revenge had never been for public consumption. It was for one man, me, and it had been served. Not with fire, but with restraint. Not with vengeance, but with order. The house grew silent again, not from grief, but from peace. One afternoon in spring, I stood at my father's grave. The flowers had faded. The stone had weathered. I ran my fingers along his name, and for the first time since that funeral, I allowed myself to say the words out loud. I fixed it. I turned away and walked back to the car. The wind rustled through the trees like applause. Not for the man I had avenged, but for the man I had become. Like your revenge quiet, legal, and absolute? Subscribe for more stories where the calmest voice in the room is the most dangerous.